couldn't take out a piece of it and treat it separately. So I'm going to apologize for the rapidity with which I go through this, but I am going to encourage people to read my paper in my chapter in the book I mentioned, and of course you can ask questions afterwards. So my focus is going to be on the field sciences, both the historical field sciences and the non-historical field sciences. And what's really interesting is that this is a debate not about astrology, it's a debate not about whether or not we ought to count parapsychology as a science, but it's about what the ordinary everyday life we take to be legitimate sciences and a debate within the scientific community, where experimentalists tend to look down upon, and we're going to look at this in detail, the work of field scientists, and field scientists tend to feel like they're second-class citizens. And the overview of the talk goes like this. I'll rip through very rapidly the first part. The distinction between science and pseudoscience is traditionally drawn in terms of the formal, logical, mathematical relation between hypothesis or theory, when we have different word hypotheses, but I mean interchangeably, and evidence. I'm going to go through this very rapidly, but I think it's important context in which to appreciate the next part, which is that all science, experimental as well as field sciences, exploit causal as well as logical constraints on their evidential reasoning, and the former depend upon the unique epistemic situations in which researchers find themselves. And those situations differ between historical field scientists, non-historical field scientists, and experimentalists. And I think that's extremely interesting. If you look at their practices, the differences which are often used to criticize the field sciences, those differences presume that there's a one-size-fits-all model for thinking about reasoning, and it's based on these kind of formal, logical, mathematical approaches to the relation between hypothesis and evidence. And finally, last, but certainly not least, attention to the differing roles of causal factors in the evidential reasoning of field scientists and experimental scientists helps to diffuse skeptical doubts among scientists about the scientific status of the former considered generally. I'm not talking about kind of doubts by people who are not scientifically or philosophically sophisticated. I'm talking about doubts which, on the face of it, may seem to be very serious. So the difference is important, I think. So, why the demarcation problem still matters? And I want to give you some quotes. These are all quotes from, with one exception, from scientists, and they're very interesting, actually. I'm going to start with the plight of the historical field sciences, which include, of course, and I'm going to be talking about the natural sciences, not the social sciences. They include paleontology. They include astrobiology, something I've had a lot to do with. They include astrophysics. They include astronomy. They include a lot of fields that you normally wouldn't think of as historical. And, of course, evolutionary biology. So here's a quote which is really rather stunning. Henry Dee was, and he still is, an editor of the very prestigious science journal Nature. He wrote a book called In Search of Deep Time, and this is a quote from that book. They, historical hypotheses, can never be tested by experiment, so they are unscientific. Rather stunning claims. The second one, of course, just points out that in the Intelligent Design Network, often they talk about historical hypotheses, and they never mind evolutionary biology, as not leading legitimate science because they are historical. Competing historical hypotheses, the best current explanation rather than an explanation that is logically compelled by experimental confirmation. Other example of the non-historical field sciences, this is a rather interesting. Freeman Dyson, I'm sure you need to know, a very famous scientist. He did particularly interesting work that I'm familiar with on origin of life, his so-called double origin theory. And he's talking here about climate science. He says, I just don't think they understand climate. Their computer models are full of bug factors. The problem here, which I hope will become clear, I don't have a lot of time, is that it's not just about computer models. There's all kinds of data from the field. And they're treating, basically, climate science, and a lot of experimentalists do this, as about the models. And I think that's a terrible mistake. Here's another lovely quote by a doctor. The public is surely, and this is on vaccines, the public is surely entitled to convincing proof, there's that favorite word, beyond all ruled out, whatever that means, that artificial immunization is in fact a safe and effective procedure. Unfortunately, such proof has never been given. So you can see that these are people who are actually trained in science. They're not cranks, they're not religious fanatics, who are casting doubt on the field of science, both historical and non-historical. So I'm going to start. I'm going to go through this very rapidly because this is kind of a backdrop to what I'm going to argue. Traditional approaches to the distinction between science and pseudoscience are, based on justificationism and falsificationism. And what's interesting about these approaches is they both assume that the critical relation between hypothesis and evidence is logical and mathematical. In modern justificationism, Bayesian updating, or frequentism, and of course falsificationism, which is still very popular among many scientists. The idea is you use a logical process of deduction and ruthlessly invoke modus tollens in the face of failed predictions, and we've heard a little bit about that last time, so I won't go into it. But there are all kinds of problems in the logic of justificationism and falsificationism, and in the application to using them as a model for actual scientific practice. And I'm just going to go through these very quickly because everybody's familiar with them. It's just to remind you of them. The problem of induction, of course, is very famous. Paradox of confirmation. Granted, Bayesian accounts claim to be able to solve some of these, but as Michael Scrivens and others have argued, the problem of induction really isn't solved by Bayesian updating. And then we have problems with falsificationism, which was the main one is the dual problem that you can always, from a logical point of view, salvage a hypothesis in the face of a failed prediction by denying auxiliary assumption. And there's lots of auxiliary assumptions, especially in field science. Especially in field science, where you really don't have much in the way of possibilities on the face of it for controlling, for and trying to identify for auxiliary assumptions that are plausible. This is a more serious problem, it seems to me. Problems in application. Scientists don't reason like good justificationists. Bayesian convergence requires an enormous number of trials to suppress the effects of the initial choice hypothesis, and in many cases, particularly in very high energy physics, you don't perform many experiments before drawing conclusions, and certainly not the number that are required for Bayesian convergence. It's an idealized model of scientific reasoning that has a particularly bad fit, it seems to me, to the actual reasoning that goes on. And ignoring lip service, scientists rarely reject their hypotheses in the face of failed predictions, but instead, what Pablo would call, protect them by fiddling with auxiliary assumptions. I speak a lot with scientists. I'm invited to talk to a lot of science conferences, and when I talk about this, I always have a group of scientists that come up afterwards and say, the only time anybody ever talks about falsificationism is when they're dealing with somebody's work that they disagree with. So they say, nobody ever talks about it if they think it's good enough, right? If they like it, they just ignore the failed predictions. So conclusion one, the distinction between science and pseudoscience cannot be drawn in terms of a purely logical, mathematical evaluative relation between hypothesis, theory, and empirical evidence. Now, I want to make it clear, I don't think that there is a crisp distinction like Popper or Loudon argued for. But that doesn't mean there aren't important differences. There are lots of borderline cases, but that doesn't mean there aren't important differences. And the point here is that when you try to draw that distinction in the way it's been traditionally drawn, what you find is it's being drawn in terms of a picture of scientific practice, the acceptance and rejection hypothesis, which really doesn't fit what's going on. So you have to ask the question, should one in such circumstances argue that the scientific practice is mistaken, or should one say there's something wrong with the model? It seems to me the place to look is the model and not the practice, because after all, it is a model of the practice. What I'm going to argue now in part two is the failure to recognize that the evidential reasoning of scientists involves appropriate appeals to extra-logical causal components specific to their differing epistemic predicaments, that we brushed out in a minute, sheds light on aspects of the actual evidential reasoning of experimental scientists that are problematic from the traditional logical mathematical perspective, plus is largely responsible for general generalized doubts about the scientific status of the field of science. They are particularly vulnerable to the kind of objections to methodology that are based on a purely logical mathematical perspective. So I want to start with the structure of classical experimental science. And I have in mind here a very special kind of experimental science, the testing of hypotheses in a controlled laboratory situation, which is only, as Franklin and many other people have pointed out, a small part of what goes on in science. Scientists do a lot more than this. But I want to focus on this because it's the whipping boy, basically, to which the field scientists are often held up. And that's why it's my focus. This is the ideal which the historical and non-historical field scientists are often said to fail to live up to. So, first thing you notice is the focus is on a single, sometimes complex hypothesis, which typically is a form of universal generalization. All C's are E's. All colors can be heated, would be a good example. And the central research activity consists in repeatedly bringing about test conditions specified by the hypothesis and controlling for extraneous conditions that might be responsible for false positives and false negatives. Important point, you don't reject the hypothesis in the face of a failed prediction. You immediately perform additional experiments to see whether or not the failed prediction is a false negative. And similarly, if you get a positive result, you worry about it being a false positive. And I think I already talked about that, so let me go through it quickly. So failed predictions rarely result in rejection of hypotheses. I would argue they're best interpreted as attempts to protect the hypothesis from false negatives or find out its robustness. Successful predictions are not followed by risky tests in proper sense. They are best interpreted as attempts to protect the hypothesis from false positives. And the acceptance and rejection of hypotheses only occurs after the hypotheses are subjected to a series of experiments controlling for plausible auxiliary assumptions that could explain predictive success and predictive failure. I always like Duham at the end of one of his articles. He says, finally, and he's criticizing falsificationism before Popper proposed it. He says, you know, finally, these are resolved by good sense. He says, good sense. And that's and that, I think, captures what is going on in these kinds of experimental programs. So I want to now move on to what I call the structure of prototypical historical science. I've written a number of articles on this, and I'll just get at the end. But most importantly for our purposes, the focus is on proliferating multiple rival hypotheses to explain a puzzling body of traces about past events in pattern field studies. Already a very major difference between what goes on in the experimental sciences. Not a generalization, but we are typically, in prototypical historical science, concerned with a particular event in the past. The Permian extinction instead of the Cretaceous extinction. These are different extinctions. And people who are investigating them in the historical research, doing historical research on them, don't assume that it's the same, that there are different instances of a generalization. In fact, there's good reason to think that the Permian extinction was caused by a very different set of events, massive volcanism in Siberia, and the Cretaceous extinction is now thought to be caused by the impact of a meteorite about the size of Mount Everest. So there's quite different sorts of activities. Certainly, you don't assume that they're the same. The general research activity is very different too. It consists in searching for a smoking gun, that's my term, a trace that sets apart one or more hypotheses and providing a better explanation for the body of traces thus far acquired in the other. What's important just to keep in mind is a smoking gun is not absolute, it's comparative. When you have a list of rival hypotheses, you look for a smoking gun to discriminate among them, and the correct hypothesis may not be among those hypotheses. So a smoking gun doesn't settle permanently any more than given the problem of induction, that a slew of experimental results with no failed predictions settles it permanently. So we have the same kind of problem. Case study. I want to talk now about the Alvarez hypothesis. And I want to emphasize that historical science is actually remarkably successful. I'll go on here. So the claim that somehow it's not legitimate science has to deal with the fact that we know a heck of a lot about the past. a great deal about the past. We know the universe is 13.7 billion years old approximately. Sure, maybe it's only 13 billion. That number fluctuates, but within a certain range, we know a great deal about the universe. And we also know that the solar system is approximately 4.5 billion years old. We know there were a number of massive extinctions. We have a pretty good idea what caused them. And in fact, another interesting fact of the matter is that it's much easier to, shall we say, infer an ancient volcanic eruption, such as the super volcano that exploded in Yellowstone National Park 2.1 million years ago, than it is to predict the next eruption or not in the universe, which I think is good about me. I can't follow this now. Still erupting. But that's really remarkable if you think about it. That makes you wonder whether or not the historical sciences might be in a better position than the non-historical field sciences, and I think they are. But certainly, it's a remarkable achievement. So, the Alvarez hypothesis is actually a two-pronged hypothesis. It's about what happened to the in-Cretaceous flora and fauna 65 million years ago, which were, this is one of the two biggest mass extinctions in the history of our planet. It's estimated that up to 87% of all species were eliminated, which means that 99.9% of all individuals went out. So we are talking about a really massive extinction event. And the Alvarez hypothesis said it was a gigantic meteorite that caused it. There are two parts of the hypothesis. The one is that a gigantic meteorite impacted 65 million years ago. It's big enough to do the job. And the second is that it actually caused the extinction. You have to separate these. I'm only going to talk for illustrative purposes about the impact. In my papers, I talk about both sides, but I'll just briefly mention that. But I think the extinction, the impact caused the extinction. But I think for our purposes, the impact illustrates what I need to talk about here. So initially, when it was suggested that the in-Cretaceous extinctions were caused by a massive meteorite impact, there was competition. Well, let me back up. Initially, there were many different explanations for the in-Cretaceous mass extinction. They included pandemic, disease, evolutionary senescence, climate change, supernova, volcanism, and meteorite impact. I remember taking a paleontology class years ago when I was an undergraduate. We got to the extinction of the dinosaurs. Waiting for the faded what caused it? The professor goes through these and others such as big game hunting aliens, and he finally, he was joking of course, he finally said, we'll probably never know. And I thought, what? We'll never know? Well, what's really stunning is that not more than 10 years later, we thought we knew. And that was the Alvarez hypothesis. Oh, I've got to go much faster, sorry. I knew this would be a problem. So let me just say the following. So how did the Alvarez, so all of these different explanations, these rival competing hypotheses collapsed to volcanism and meteorite impact. The discovery of the iridium anomaly is what collapsed it, and there's the volcanism and meteorite impact. Why? Because iridium is rare on the crust of the Earth. So the planets that go under iridium is a heavy element. Planets that undergo differentiation, most of it's in the core with iron. And you have this incredible enrichment in a tiny layer of sediment in iridium with, on either side of the boundary, the sort of standard. So you had that 30 to 1,000 times background levels of iridium in that tiny boundary, and that was pretty remarkable. So everything else just fell out of, people just ceased considering the others and focused on these two. The discovery of a very extensive quantity of a rare form of shock mineral subsequently cinched the case for impact over volcanism, because there are only two places on Earth where that mineral is found: meteor craters and in the craters of nuclear explosions. And so the coupled two between the iridium and the shock quartz pretty much settled it for most scientists, even though there's occasionally some. I'm going to skip this. The same kind of process went through with paleontologists. Lessons from the Alvarez hypothesis. I'm going to go through this quickly. Hypotheses are not grounded in prediction. A hypothesis may be rejected on the basis of evidence that does not refute it. The contagion hypothesis of disease, pandemic hypothesis. The Cretaceous extinction is not refuted by an iridium anomaly. The pandemic could occur before or after the impact. The acceptance of a hypothesis does not require a successful prediction. The iridium anomaly could not have been predicted. Not all meteorites are rich in iridium, only those that have undergone planetary differentiation. Ground and explanatory power. Hypotheses are accepted and rejected in virtue of their power to explain versus predict puzzling bodies of traces discovered through field work. And the key here is that the Alvarez hypothesis explains an otherwise puzzling association or correlation among traces that is any of its rivals. It is for this reason it is considered confirmed that its rivals are no longer seriously entertained by scientists. And I'm going to show you two asymmetries now, which are causal, which I think can be used to understand what's going on, not only in historical science, but experimental science. Time asymmetry of causation. Most local events and structures overdetermine their past causes because the latter typically leave extensive and diverse effects, and underdetermine their future effects because they rarely constitute the total cause and effect. In a nutshell, the present contains records of the past but not of the future. Asymmetry of manipulation. Time asymmetry of causation, based on the fact that events in the present causally affect events in the future, but not events in the past. There's no backward causation. That's the assumption here. And another way to think of this is that one can causally twiddle with things in the future, but not the past. They can causally affect things in the future, but not the past, by twiddling with events in the past. Historical scientists are disadvantaged. I'm almost done. Historical scientists are disadvantaged by the asymmetry of manipulation because they can't manipulate the past, but advantaged by the asymmetry of overdetermination, and they exploit this in their evidential reasoning. The search for a smoking gun to discriminate among competing hypotheses. The asymmetry of overdetermination guarantees there are likely to be many such traces if you're just clever enough to find them and recognize them for what they represent. Interestingly enough, there are no records of the past. In the present, historical reasoning would be impossible. Experimental scientists are disadvantaged by the asymmetry of overdetermination. There are no records of the future in the present, but advantaged by the asymmetry of manipulation. And they exploit the latter in their evidential reasoning. They attempt to constrain the threat of false positives and false negatives by manipulating events in the present, by engaging in experimental programs. They don't reject, on the basis of failed prediction, their hypothesis. Experimental reasoning would be impossible for mere observers like Michael Dunham talked about intelligent trees, for which they had no sense. They just watched events parading past them. They would have no ability to actually think experimentally, to engage in the kind of reasoning that experimentalists do. They obviously couldn't perform experiments, but they couldn't even engage in experimental reasoning. That's the point that I'm making here. Conclusion. Historical and experimental scientists appeal to and cope with different extralogical causal considerations, reflecting different sides of the asymmetries of manipulation or determination in the testing and evaluation of hypotheses. And here's an appetizer. I don't have time to talk about the non-historical field sciences. That's where I'm interested in working now. But they are disadvantaged by both. And if you actually look at their work, this is what Freeman Dyson didn't understand, they cope with it by drawing on both. Their models are calibrated by close attention to past historical record. And the past historical record can sometimes stand on its own, and it's used to calibrate the models, and it's a very complex process, extremely interesting, but unfortunately beyond the scope of this. So, in slide. Relevance to the demarcation problem. To the extent that the core evidential relation involved in accepting and rejecting scientific hypotheses has traditionally been taken to be logical mathematical, and the relevant puzzle of epistemic asymmetries that are also involved, as I recognize, it's hardly surprising the practices of field scientists are viewed with skepticism. And I just want to say that it's clear that because they do have these different asymmetrical positions of time, historical scientists looking from the present to the past, experimental scientists looking from the present to the future, their epistemic situations are different. They're causally situated differently in